The Velvet Note was the kind of place where the light was always golden, even at night. Soft lamps glowed on dark wood tables, and the air smelled of expensive coffee, old books, and polished leather. It was a bubble of quiet calm in the middle of the busy city. People came here to talk in low voices, to think, or to just get lost in the music from the baby grand piano in the corner. He was a regular there. Everyone knew him, or at least they knew of him. He had made a fortune, people said, from something to do with computers and the internet. He was not an old man, but he carried himself like someone who was used to winning. He always sat in the same booth at the back, the one that gave him a view of the whole room. It was his unofficial throne. Tonight he was holding court again, surrounded by a few well-dressed people who laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. His name was Elias Dot, and then there was her. She moved through the crowded lounge like a shadow, quiet, efficient, and almost invisible. She was a waitress. Her name tag simply read Clara. She had been working at the Velvet Note for about a year. She wasn't much for small talk, but she was watchful. She remembered that the old man in the tweed jacket liked his espresso with a single sugar cube placed beside the cup, not in it. She knew the young woman who came to write novels always needed a second glass of water, no ice. Clara saw everything, but she shared very little. Her hands were interesting. They were strong and capable, with long fingers. They never shook, not even when carrying a heavy tray full of drinks above a customer's head. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her fingers would tap a silent, complicated rhythm on the side of her tray, as if listening to a song only she could hear. On this particular evening, the scheduled pianist, a lovely older man who played gentle jazz standards, had finished his last set. The gentle background music switched to a soft recorded playlist, and a different kind of quiet settled over the room. It was in this quiet that Elias's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the air. "Clara, a moment, please." She turned, tray in hand, and walked to his booth. "More scotch, sir?" she asked, her voice level and polite. "No, no," he said, waving a hand. He was in a playful mood, the kind that often comes from good whiskey and a captive audience. He gestured toward the silent, shiny black grand piano. "Our musical entertainment seems to have clocked out for the night. Be a dear and see if you can rouse someone from the kitchen. We need a bit of life in here." Clara's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir. The pianist's time is finished. The management doesn't allow other staff to play. It's a policy." This seemed to amuse Elias even more. He leaned back, a smile playing on his lips. He looked at his friends, then back at Clara. Idea, the kind that feels clever when you've had a few drinks, struck him. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He placed it on the table with a soft tap, drawing the eyes of everyone at his table. "Tell you what," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "A little challenge. A bit of fun. For this 100, you go over to that piano and play us? Well, anything. How about chopsticks? Surely you know chopsticks? Give us a little private show." The air around the booth grew stiff. His friends chuckled nervously, not sure if they should be enjoying this. At other tables, conversations died down. People glanced over, some feeling embarrassed for the waitress, others just curious to see what would happen. It was that awful, cringe-worthy moment where someone with power decides to make a joke out of someone without it. Clara looked at the money on the table. She didn't look at Elias's face. Her eyes were fixed on that green bill. For a long second, she was perfectly still. You could see the thoughts moving behind her eyes, the insult of it, the easy cruelty disguised as a game. She needed the job. She needed the tips. Causing a scene was the last thing she should do. But then something shifted. It wasn't anger that flashed across her features. It was something colder, more determined. It was the look of someone who had made a decision. She carefully placed her heavy serving tray down on an empty stand. The soft clink of the glasses was the only sound in the hushed section of the lounge. Without a word, without even glancing at the $100 bill, she turned her back on Elias Thorne and his booth. She walked, not with hurried steps, but with a slow, deliberate grace, toward the grand piano. The spotlight that was usually on the pianist was off, leaving the instrument in a pool of softer, ambient light. A whisper went through the room. "She's actually doing it," someone murmured. They expected a red face, fumbling hands, the plinking, silly notes of a beginner's tune. They prepared for a moment of second-hand embarrassment, a story the rich man would tell later about the waitress he paid to play a joke. Clara reached the piano. She ran her fingers lightly along its smooth, black lid, a touch that seemed almost like a greeting. Then she sat on the polished bench. She didn't slump into it like an amateur. She adjusted it slightly, her movements practiced and sure. She placed her feet on the pedals. She let her hands rest in her lap for a brief moment, taking a slow, deep breath that seemed to center her entire being. When she finally lifted her hands and placed them over the ivory keys, her posture was completely different. The weary waitress was gone. In her place sat a person transformed, back straight, shoulders set, head held with a quiet authority. The room was now utterly, completely silent. Every eye was on her. Elias leaned forward, his playful smile finally fading, replaced by a faint line of confusion between his brows. Her fingers descended, and the sound that came out was not chopsticks. The sound that filled the velvet note was not a single note, but a deep, resonant chord. It was low and rich, like a distant thunderstorm heard from far away. It vibrated through the wooden floor and up through the legs of the chairs. That single, powerful sound wiped away the last of the quiet whispers and nervous shuffling. Every single person in the room froze. Then her hands began to move. Was not the slow, careful pressing of someone who barely knew how to play. It was a fluid explosion of motion. Her fingers, those same fingers that had so steadily carried trays and wiped tables, now flew across the keyboard with a life of their own. They were a blur of precise, confident movement, leaping from the deep, rumbling bass notes to the sparkling, high notes near the top. A melody emerged, beautiful but full of a deep, aching sadness. It swirled through the room, pulling at the hearts of everyone listening. This was not background music. This was a story being told without words. You could hear longing in it. You could hear a fierce, powerful strength. There were moments of gentle, heartbreaking softness that made people hold their breath, followed by passages of such furious, crashing power that the glasses on the table seemed to tremble. The manager, a practical man who spent his days counting inventory and managing schedules, had been polishing a wine glass behind the bar. His hands stopped moving. The cloth hung limp in his fingers as he stared, his mouth slightly open. He had hired Clara because she was reliable and quiet. He had no idea at the rich man's booth. The scene was completely transformed. The amused smiles of his guests had vanished. One man had his hand paused halfway to his mouth, his forgotten drink hovering in the air. A woman had her fingers pressed to her lips, her eyes wide. Elias, the man who had started it all, felt the confident, smug feeling drain from his body, replaced by a cold shock. He was not a musical expert, but he knew enough about the world to recognize incredible skill when he saw it. This was not a party trick. This was the kind of playing you heard in grand concert halls, from people whose names were printed on expensive programs. He had dared a master to perform a child's joke, and she had answered him with a masterpiece. He watched her face. It was no longer the polite, neutral mask of the waitress. As she played, Emotions washed over her features. A slight frown of concentration, a fleeting pain in her eyes during a sorrowful passage, a subtle lift of her chin when the music surged with defiance. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world made of sound and memory. The piano was no longer just a piece of furniture in a lounge. Under her hands, it became a living thing, sighing, roaring, whispering, weeping. A young couple on a date at a small table near the front had completely forgotten each other. They both stared at Clara, caught in the spell of the music. The man later said he felt like he was watching someone's soul being poured out right in front of him. And it was both private and magnificent. An older gentleman sitting alone, who came to the lounge every night to read his newspaper in peace, slowly folded the paper and set it aside. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. A single quiet tear traced a path down his wrinkled cheek. The song, he thought, understood something about life that was hard to put into words. For the entire duration of the piece, which felt like both a single second and an entire lifetime, no one in the velvet note moved. No one clicked a glass. No one cleared their throat. The only sound was the piano, a roaring river of notes, a delicate trickle of melody, a storm of emotion. It built and built, tension winding tighter and tighter, until it reached a breathtaking peak of such powerful, crashing chords that it seemed impossible for one person to be making all that sound. And then it ended, not with a gentle fade, but with a final, decisive series of notes that landed with the weight of a closing door. The last sound hung in the air, a vibration that slowly dissolved into silence. Clara's hands fell still. She lifted them from the keys and let them rest in her lap. She sat there for a moment, her head bowed, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep, slow breath. She was coming back to the room, leaving that other world behind. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before she played. It was a stunned, reverent quiet. Then, as if someone had released a held breath, the room erupted. It started with a single person clapping, then another, and then the whole lounge was filled with the sound of genuine, thunderous applause. People rose to their feet. Whistles cut through the air. The young couple was cheering. The older man was nodding, clapping with solemn respect. Clara stood up from the bench. The transformation reversed itself. The powerful, commanding presence shrank back into the simple, quiet woman in a waitress's uniform. She gave the room a small, almost shy nod of acknowledgement, but her eyes were not seeking their praise. They were focused on the floor. She walked back through the crowd, which parted for her as if she were a queen returning from a battle. The applause followed her. She didn't look left or right. She walked straight past the rich man's booth, where his guests were also now standing and clapping, their faces filled with awe. She reached the spot where she had left her tray. She picked it up, the familiar weight of it in her hands. Only then did she finally look up. Her gaze met Elias's. His face was pale, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He wasn't clapping. He was just staring at her, trying to understand who she was, trying to fit the world-class pianist into the image of the woman who had served him whiskey for months. Clara held his gaze for just a second. In her eyes, there was no anger, no gloating, no demand for an apology. There was just a calm, deep quiet, like the surface of a still lake after a quake has passed underneath. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen doors, the sound of the roaring applause at her back, ready to get back to work. The applause followed Clara like a wave, crashing against the kitchen's swinging doors before they shut behind her, muffling the sound to a distant rumble. Inside the kitchen, it was a different world. The air was warm and thick, with the smell of roasting vegetables and fresh bread. A line cook was scrubbing a pan, the radio playing a tinny pop song. He looked up as she entered. "Hey, what's all the noise out there? Someone break a whole tray of glasses?" he asked with a chuckle. Clara just gave him a small, tired smile and shook her head. Just some excitement, she said softly. She walked to the small sink in the corner, her movements automatic. She turned on the cool water and let it run over her wrists. Her hands, which had just moments ago been commanding a storm of music, now trembled slightly under the stream. She wasn't nervous. It was the leftover energy, the electricity of the music, slowly draining from her fingers. She took a deep breath, feeling the quiet hum of the kitchen fridge replace the symphony in her ears. Back in the lounge, the noise was slowly dying down into a buzz of disbelief. People were returning to their seats, but no one was talking about what they had come to talk about. Every conversation was about her. Did you know? Had you ever heard her before? That was. I've paid hundreds for concert tickets that weren't half that good. Who is she? At his booth, the rich man Elias was still sitting down while his guests remained standing, buzzing with excitement. One of them, a woman in a sleek black dress, turned to him, her eyes shining. Elias, you absolute genius. How did you know? That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life. You set that up, didn't you? Her words landed on him like little stones. He hadn't set it up. He had tried to make a fool of someone, and instead he had been the fool. The $100 bill still lay on the table where he'd placed it. It looked silly now, insulting. He slowly reached out and put it back in his pocket, the crisp paper feeling shameful. He didn't answer his friend. Instead, he stood up. The movement felt stiff. He walked away from the booth, away from the questions, and made his way to the bar. The manager was still there, looking a little dazed, mechanically putting away the glass he had been polishing an eternity ago. The waitress, Elias said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. He cleared his throat. Clara, how long has she worked here? The manager looked at him, his expression complex. There was a hint of protective sternness in his eyes. About a year. She's my best employee. Never late. Never complains. But the piano. Elias gestured weakly toward the instrument, which now sat silent and ordinary again. Did you know she could play like that? The manager sighed, leaning on the bar. I knew she played. Sometimes very late. After we close, I'd hear her. Just little bits of things. Beautiful things. I asked her once if she wanted to do a proper set on the clock. She said no. She said she just plays for herself now. Said it was private. He gave Elias a look that was not quite angry, but carried a heavy weight of understanding. She doesn't like a fuss. Elias nodded slowly. The words private and doesn't like a fuss echoed in his mind, making his earlier dare seem even more loud and ugly. He was a man who solved problems. He fixed things. Right now, he had created a problem, and the weight of it was uncomfortable. He found himself walking toward the kitchen doors. He pushed one open slightly. The warmth and the noise of the kitchen spilled out. He saw her. She wasn't hiding or crying. She was refilling a stainless steel pitcher with ice water, her back to him. She then picked up a clean tray and began carefully loading it with cups and saucers for a new table, her movements steady and focused. He just watched for a moment. This was the woman he saw every week, efficient, quiet, invisible. How had he never looked closer? How had he never seen the strength in her posture, the careful intelligence in her eyes? He had only ever seen the waitress. He let the door swing shut. He wasn't sure what to say. I'm sorry, felt too small, and anything else felt like he'd just be making more noise around her. He returned to his booth, where his friends were still chattering excitedly. He paid the bill, a large tip added automatically, and told them he needed to leave. The night's fun was over for him. Out on the quiet street, the cool night air felt sharp. His driver pulled up, but Elias waved him away. He wanted to walk. The image of Clara at the piano played over and over in his mind. The complete transformation, the raw emotion, the sheer mastery. And then the image of her at the sink, washing the feeling away. He thought about his own life. His success was built on being loud, on disrupting things, on proving people wrong. His wins were in boardrooms and deal meetings. They were about numbers and headlines. Her win tonight was different. It was silent, profound, and it had nothing to do with him or his money. He had thrown a pebble, trying to make a small splash, and she had revealed an ocean he never knew was there, for the first time in a very long time. Elias Thorne, the millionaire who always had the last word, felt completely insignificant, and he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that a simple apology would not be enough. He had trespassed on something sacred, and he needed to understand what it was he had interrupted. He needed to know who she was, not to satisfy his curiosity, but because for once he realized the story wasn't about him at all. The next few days at the Velvet Note were strange. A different kind of quiet settled over the lounge. It wasn't the quiet of boredom, but of a held breath. Everyone who had been there that night came back, often bringing friends. They would order their drinks, their eyes constantly flicking toward the piano, and then toward the waitress moving calmly between the tables. Clara did her job exactly as before. She took orders, delivered plates, cleared glasses. She was polite and efficient. But now, when she approached a table, conversations would often stumble to a halt. People looked at her with a new kind of attention, a mixture of awe and curiosity that made the air feel thick. They wanted to ask questions. They wanted to tell her how her playing made them feel. But something in her calm, focused demeanor held them back. She wasn't rude, but she gave off a clear signal. That part of her life was not a topic for discussion. One afternoon, an older woman, a regular who came for tea every Thursday, finally found the courage. As Clara set down her porcelain cup, the woman gently touched her wrist. "My dear," she said, her voice soft, "that music you played, it was the most beautiful thing I have heard since my husband passed. It sounded like goodbye, but a peaceful one. Thank you." Clara paused. She looked at the woman's kind, watery eyes. The professional mask softened, just for a second. She gave a small, genuine nod. "Thank you for listening," she whispered. That was all she said before moving on. It was enough. Elias, the rich man, did not come back for a week. When he finally returned, he came alone, in the middle of a slow Tuesday afternoon. He chose a small table, not his usual booth. He saw Clara the moment he walked in. She was folding napkins into neat shapes at the service station. She glanced up, met his eyes for a fraction of a second, and then looked back down at her work. No anger, no recognition. Just the same quiet neutrality. It unnerved him more than if she had thrown a drink in his face. He ordered a coffee. When she brought it, he spoke before she could leave. "Clara." His voice was uncharacteristically hesitant. "Could you? Would you have a moment to sit?" "Just for a minute." She stopped, the empty tray held at her side. She looked at the chair, then back at him. "I'm working, sir, but I can listen for a moment if you need something for your order." It was a gentle but firm wall. He was a customer. She was staff. He fumbled for a moment, then simply took a plain white envelope from his jacket pocket. He placed it on the table between them. It had no name on it. It's not money," he said quickly, seeing her eyes flick to it. "It's a letter. An apology. A real one. You don't have to read it. But I needed to write it." Clara looked at the envelope, then at his face. He looked tired. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something more uncertain, more real. She gave a single, slow nod. She didn't pick up the envelope. She simply said, "I'll see that I get it when my shift ends." "Will there be anything else for your coffee?" That was it. She walked away. Elias sat there, sipping his now tasteless coffee, feeling a fool all over again, but in a different, quieter way. Later, in the clean, silent break room, Clara sat on a stiff plastic chair. The envelope lay on the table in front of her. She finished her cup of water before finally picking it up. The paper was thick and expensive. Inside was a single sheet, covered in neat, forceful handwriting. Clara. I am writing to apologize for my behavior last week. It was arrogant, rude, and deeply disrespectful. I treated you as a prop for a joke, and in doing so, I insulted a gift I cannot even comprehend. I have spent my life believing that loudness equals strength, and that money can measure value. You showed me, in a few minutes, how wrong I have been. What you have is a different kind of power, a true one. I asked the manager about you. He only said you used to play professionally, and that you left that world. I do not know your story, and it is not my business. But I want you to know that your music that night did more than shock a room. It humbled a man who badly needed humbling. I will not bother you again. But if there is ever anything, not a favor, but a way to make right the disrespect I showed, the offer stands. Not with money, but with action. With sincere respect, Elias Thorne Clara. Read the letter twice. Her face showed little. She folded it carefully along its original creases and slid it back into the envelope. She didn't throw it away. She placed it inside her bag, next to her house keys and her phone. A few days later, the manager approached her during a quiet moment. He looked uncomfortable. "Clara, I've had a request. Well, more than a few, actually, from customers. They're asking if you might ever play again. Not as a stunt, just to play. I've told them no, of course. I've said it's your private business. But I thought I should tell you." He expected her to shut it down immediately. She was quiet for a long time, looking out at the empty piano bench. She thought of the old woman's thankful eyes. She thought of the heavy, listening silence of the room that night, a silence full of feeling, not of mockery. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "Maybe sometimes, on a quiet night, if I feel like it." But no announcements, no promises. The manager's face broke into a relieved smile. Of course. No announcements. Absolutely. The ripple of that one night continued to spread. Elias began showing up at classical concerts in the city, something he had never done before. He didn't just sit in the best seats. He started asking questions, learning about the years of practice, the pressure, the soul that goes into the art. He was, for the first time in a long time, a student, not a master. One evening, Clara was leaving work. It was late, and the street was dark and shiny from a recent rain. She saw a man standing under a street lamp a little way off. It was Elias. He wasn't approaching her. He was just standing there, as if waiting for a bus. He saw her, and instead of speaking, he simply gave a small, respectful nod. It was an acknowledgement, not an intrusion. Clara, after a brief pause, nodded back. It was a tiny motion, almost invisible. Then she turned and walked the other way, towards her own life. The silent understanding in that exchange was worth more than any shouted apology. The world had tried to put her in a small, simple box labeled Waitress. For a few minutes, she had let herself out. And now, everyone, including the man who had dared her, had to learn to see her as she truly was, a person, complex and deep, who could not be defined by a single word. Time moved on at the velvet note. The buzz from that one incredible night slowly faded into a cherished story, a piece of the lounge's own legend. New customers came and went, unaware of the magic that had once happened near the old piano. But for the regulars, the room always held a special charge, a feeling that something extraordinary was still present, just beneath the surface. Clara continued her work. The rhythm of her days was the same, the quiet morning prep, the steady flow of the lunch crowd, the soft hum of the evening jazz. Yet something inside her had settled. For years, playing the piano had been tangled up with old memories, pressure, harsh lights, the feeling of being judged on every single note. It was why she had walked away. The piano had become a place of pain, so she had put it in a box and tried to leave it in her past. That night, with the rich man's dare hanging in the air, something had broken open. Not just in the room, but in her. She had played not for judges or for a career, but for herself, in defiance of a silly challenge. And the room hadn't judged. They had listened. They had heard her. The music, for the first time in a long time, had felt free. One rainy Thursday evening, the lounge was especially quiet. Only a handful of people were scattered about, reading or talking in low tones. The scheduled pianist had called in sick. The manager was about to turn on the usual background music system when he caught Clara's eye. He didn't say anything. He just raised his eyebrows in a silent question, glancing toward the piano. Clara was wiping down the bar. She paused, looking at the empty bench. She felt no panic, no old dread, just a quiet, gentle pull. She gave the manager a small, almost invisible nod. She finished wiping the counter. She put her cloth away. Then, without any announcement, she walked over to the piano, just as she had done weeks before. But this walk was different. There was no weight of a dare on her shoulders. This was her own choice. A few people looked up. One of the regulars, the older gentleman who came to read, noticed first. He slowly put his book down, a smile touching his lips. He gently nudged the young woman sitting next to him, who was studying on her laptop. She looked up, and her eyes widened in recognition. Clara sat down. She didn't need to take a deep breath to brace herself this time. She simply placed her hands on the keys and began to play. It wasn't the powerful, stormy piece from before. This was something softer, more like a flowing river at dusk. It was a gentle, melancholic piece by Debussy, notes falling like raindrops on a window pane. The sound spread through the quiet room. Conversations died not out of shock, but out of a natural respect for the beauty that was being offered. People put down their phones. They closed their books. They just listened. They watched the waitress, who once again was no longer a waitress, but a guide leading them through a landscape of sound. She played for maybe 10 minutes. When the final note faded, there was no thunderous applause. Instead, there was a warm, soft clapping, the kind that feels like a thank you. A few people murmured, "Beautiful. Just beautiful." Clara gave them a small, genuine smile, a rare sight that lit up her face, and then returned to the bar to finish her shift. This became the new, unwritten rule. On quiet nights, when the mood was right, Clara might play. Never on a busy Friday. Never when the lounge was full of chatter. Only when the atmosphere felt still, when the room seemed to ask for it. There were no schedules. You had to be lucky to be there. The manager never advertised it. The regulars, however, developed a sense for it. They would notice the particular calm in Clara's demeanor, a certain look in her eye, and they would settle in, hoping. As for the rich man, Elias, his change was less visible, but just as real. He still made money. He still lived in his big house. But the frantic, showy edge to his life had softened. He used a large part of his wealth to start a new foundation. But it wasn't like his others. This one didn't just give trophies or sponsor flashy competitions. It focused on supporting young musicians with mentors who taught balance, on funding music therapy programs, and on helping artists who felt burned out, offering them grants to step back and find their love for music again on their own terms. He called it the Second Note Foundation. The name was his own quiet, private nod to a second chance. He never discussed the foundation with Clara. He didn't need her approval. It was his own way of repaying a debt to an understanding he never had before. One evening, almost a year after the dare, Hylias was sitting in his usual booth. It was one of those quiet nights. Clara was working. The lounge was half full. He watched as she finished taking an order, then walked not toward the kitchen, but toward the piano. A hush of happy anticipation fell over the regulars who recognized the signs. She played a short, joyful piece by Mozart. It was light and clever, full of playful energy. It was completely different from the first piece she had played for them, but it was just as true. Elias listened, a calm smile on his face. He wasn't the center of this story anymore. He was just another person in the audience, grateful to be allowed to listen. After her song, as she walked back past his booth, he didn't try to stop her. He simply said, so only she could hear, "Thank you." Clara paused. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the boastful millionaire from a year ago, but a quieter, more thoughtful man. She gave him a single nod. "You're welcome," she said softly, and then she moved on, picking up a tray to clear the next table. The music was over. The work continued. But in that room, everyone now understood that the most extraordinary people often look the most ordinary. That hidden beauty walks among us every day, carrying its own quiet rhythm, waiting for the right moment, or for no moment at all, to simply be itself. The piano sat silent again, but the air around it still seemed to hum with the memory and the promise of the next note.